I grew up a few minutes outside of the town of Springfield, Missouri, a bustling metropolis nestled in the heart of the Ozark Mountains, so not too lively, but rated by USA Today as one of the least diverse towns in America. While the homogeneity of the region was quite pronounced, my childhood experiences are certainly different from what you might assume. I could actually be found learning memory games from a group of Japanese businessmen, or dancing along to the lively melody of a mariachi band performing in our town square. Now, these experiences are not typical of my region, but rather they were made possible by a group of changemakers who challenged the limitations of cross-cultural barriers and borders. This group, of which my grandmother was a founding member, created a cultural exchange program between Tlaquepaque, Mexico, East Sasaki, Japan, and my own hometown of Springfield, Missouri. This group was composed of cities that were destined to exist a world apart, but found the one thing that they all had in common: people seeking connection. Sister Cities, the organization, bridged this desire for connection in a creative way, cultivating an untraditional childhood for myself in southern Missouri, and leading me to identify the other assumptions in my life worth questioning. Assumptions that may prevent me from accessing the wealth of information and people that this world has to offer. Now, the hard part about challenging my assumptions is that it's quite difficult. It opens you to a feeling of vulnerability that comes with potentially being wrong. This leads us to want to pursue knowledge and experiences that already feel familiar to us or confirm what we believe. This is actually quite common. Known as confirmation bias, it's the act of seeking knowledge that confirms our ideas, opinions, or beliefs that we hold to be true. Engaging in confirmation bias makes it impossible to question our own assumptions and can actually lead to greater social and intellectual isolation. Perhaps this is best demonstrated on social media. When it comes to social media, we cultivate a network of friends and stream of content that reinforces our own opinions without ever enabling them to evolve. According to data from the Pew Research Center, 47% of conservatives admit that most or all of the political content shared on their feed reflects their own political beliefs. Additionally, 44% of liberals admit to consistently unfriending or blocking users that share political content inconsistent with their beliefs. While these statistics are quite staggering, perhaps they're not that surprising, as many of us in this room can admit to doing the same thing. However, confirmation bias is not just limited to our rejection or intake of information as it relates to our own opinions. It can actually affect some of the most important decisions in our lives, such as the decision to pursue a particular career path. According to data from the General Social Survey, sons are 2.4 times as likely, and daughters are 1.7 times as likely, to pursue the same occupation as one or more of their parents. This is because we see our parents' occupations as honorable, associated with information or activities that feels familiar to us and admirable, compelling us to potentially pursue the same occupation without any further consideration of our own. Before coming into this talk, perhaps you didn't see the connection between a decision like pursuing a job and the underlying biases that may have motivated that decision. And that's because we're primed to think about bias in one way, with one consequence: stereotyping. And while this certainly is a large effect of bias, it's a bias in and of itself. Today, we're going to challenge the biases that we hold about bias, starting with the biggest bias of them all. My biases may affect my opinions or decisions, but they don't extend outside of those contexts. One of the most consequential effects of confirmation bias is actually the creation of associative barriers. mental divisions that prevent us from making associations between diverse sets of ideas, people, or experiences in our life. Ultimately, associative barriers undermine our creative potential and can limit the number of connections we are able to form between ourselves and others. So let's test the strength of our own associative barriers today. I'm going to put up a set of 3 words that are all linked together through some sort of association to a 4th word. When I put up those 3 words, I want you to shout out, and don't be afraid, what you think that linking word may be. So let's start with the first one. Chocolate, tin, and fortune. What is the word that you think links these all together? Cookie, great. Square, cardboard, open. Box, you're so smart. Blank, white lines. Sore, sweat, shoulder. Exercise. Okay, I'm hearing exercise. That's actually a pretty typical response when individuals look at this 4th set of words. That's because we apply the same associative pattern that was successful in the first 3 sets to the way in which we approach the 4th. But the correct linking word here is actually cold. Cold sore, cold sweat, cold shoulder. Our associative barriers prevent us from making this connection because we want to utilize frameworks that are already familiar to us. We do this all the time. Think about the last time you applied a successful study technique to study for a 2nd class, even if that study technique wasn't actually designed for the structure of the 2nd class. Instead of evaluating every problem or decision in our lives in its own unique context, we prioritize efficiency and approach every facet of our lives with the same mindset, stifling both our creativity and our success. So if associative barriers and confirmation bias are such a large issue, how can we address these challenges, and who is best equipped to address these challenges? When it comes to something like social bias, we often identify institutions as the ideal actor because institutions can enact change on a broader level. While institutions can certainly be an asset in overcoming confirmation bias, they're not the solution. Institutions are large and slow-moving and therefore must prioritize certain issues above others. They employ their own confirmation biases to determine what they believe to be the dominant cause of a certain problem. For example, if a hospital network wanted to increase the number of patients that take their medication at the prescribed rate, they may identify the dominant cause of that problem to be that many people simply forget to take their medication. However, the reason why I forget to take my medication is quite different from the reason why you forget to take yours or you forget to take yours, if you forget at all. While we all may have the same problem, it's caused by distinctly different factors. Therefore, something as broad as an institution isn't actually the best actor equipped to address these challenges, particularly something as individualized as confirmation bias. Institutions can provide helpful opportunities and resources that expose us to new ideas, people, or places, just as Sister Cities does during its cultural exchange program. However, it's ultimately up to us to decide whether or not we are going to absorb those experiences and respond to them in a way that enhances both our creativity and our connectivity. The research shows that we don't feel too confident in our ability to overcome our biases on our own. We see them as too deeply rooted and unchangeable. Admittedly, overcoming confirmation bias is not a process that can happen overnight. It requires a conscious commitment to welcoming diverse sets of information, priming your mind to think creatively, and dismantling your own associative barriers. This process will have to start inorganically, but can quickly evolve to be something that is more natural as we awaken the cognitive processes in our brain that can freely associate between diverse sets of ideas. The research proves this to be true. In a study conducted in 1962, the researcher Mednick welcomed a group of participants who had all lived abroad at some point in their life. He then divided these participants into 4 distinct groups and asked the first group to reflect on their experience living abroad, the second to reflect on a time traveling abroad, the third to think about the last time they had visited the grocery store, and the fourth group wasn't asked to think about any particular situation. After the reflection times, the four groups were each given the same sets of words that we saw a few minutes ago and asked to form some associations. For the group that had reflected on their time living abroad before completing the association tests, they were able to make 2 times more associations than the control group. This is largely a result of that group priming their minds to think creatively and freely. When you reflect on an experience like living abroad, a time when you're exposed to individuals from diverse cultural backgrounds, you adapt your lifestyle routine to cater to the norms of another place, another country. You are awakening the same cognitive processes that you employed while abroad to respond to those situations in order to evaluate the problem at hand. They also are able to widen their knowledge base and draw from more immediate and diverse knowledge in making associations between those 3 sets of words. So Lexi, basically what you're telling me is that I have to live abroad to overcome my biases and think creatively. Actually, we do not have to have a transformative experience like living abroad to think in a transformative way. We can prime our minds to think creatively in everyday activities, starting by challenging our own assumptions. Now, I find that it's a lot easier for me to challenge the assumptions of my younger sister than it is for me to challenge my own. This is because challenging your own assumptions feels uncomfortable and evokes that same feeling of vulnerability that I mentioned earlier. However, just like associating, it can become a process that feels more natural over time. So in order to prime your mind to think creatively, we have to start by stating what those assumptions might be, whether those assumptions are facts or just widely held opinions. So let's take the example of dining out. So some assumptions that I have about dining out are that restaurants offer meals. I order my meal from a menu, and a chef prepares my meal for me. Now I'm going to state the opposite of all of these assumptions, even if those statements are widely regarded as untrue. So in this case, that might be, restaurants do not offer meals. I do not order my meal from the menu, and a chef does not prepare my meal for me. Now we have to ask ourselves, what information do we need to arrive at the opposite conclusion from what our assumptions would currently suggest? In this case, it might look something like this. A new restaurant opens where customers bring their own ingredients to co-cook alongside other customers, sharing ingredients, advice, or recipes as needed, and then share their meals together in a common dining space. Not only does this idea challenge all of the assumptions we hold about dining out, but it's also a creative concept that I will be trademarking immediately following this talk. Now, if you're having trouble challenging your assumptions on your own, I ask you to reach out to the people in your life that you know can stimulate your creative processes. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, "If a man can build a better mousetrap, write a better book, or preach a better sermon than his neighbor, but he made his house in the woods, the world will make a beaten path to his door." That is to say that no matter how creative we think we are, if we don't seek out connection with other individuals who can challenge our assumptions and facilitate our creative processes, all of that work will be in vain. However, there are several ways that we can intentionally form these connections in order to stimulate creative thinking. The first is to speak with others outside of our own discipline. Individuals outside of our discipline do not share the same assumptions or limitations that ourselves and our peers may hold. History proves the success of this principle in practice. A salesman from Panasonic took a set of camcorders from the company to his son's birthday party for his son and his friends to enjoy. One of his son's friends held up the camcorder and said, "This is cool and all, but I'm left-handed and the camcorder strap is on the right side. so it's difficult for me to use. Panasonic then became the first media electronics company to offer a left-handed camcorder. Second, seek out creative people. Research shows that the most creative people are those that are well-read, come from opposite value systems than our own, have a zest for life, possess strong listening skills, and can see the absurdity in things. When we look at this in practice, we can look no farther than American steel companies in the 1800s, who actually contracted ministers to conduct their hiring processes for them, believing that because these ministers came from a strong moral background, they could identify the workers with the highest amounts of moral character and strong work ethic. Finally, draw out creativity from those that you meet. If you're willing to take on that feeling of vulnerability and share your thoughts, opinions, ideas, and creative challenges with everyone that you meet, you may be surprised at how others reciprocate that vulnerability and offer ideas of their own that you may not have initially considered. Let's take a local example. During the St. Louis World's Fair, the ice cream vendor ran out of bowls in which to sell his ice cream. The waffle vendor next door offered to sell him some waffles to place the ice cream on. In this exchange, the waffle cone as we know it was born, and the rest is history. So I encourage you to reflect. What are the challenges in your life that create assumptions that can prevent you from being creative and connected? Who is best equipped to help you challenge those assumptions? For me, that group has always been Sister Cities, who 21 years later is still challenging me to find connections between the different people, places, and experiences in my own life. Their laughter and livelihood transform a typical day in southern Missouri into a not-so-typical day after all. How would a typical day in your world look different if you primed your mind to think creatively and motivated yourself to seek connection instead of confirmation? Thank you.